My name is Angel, and welcome back to my channel for yet another wine and crime nights. Now, tonight we will be going over one of your requested video choices. I actually wrote out a full script for one of them. Forgot to YouTube if anyone else had done it, if it was super popular or not, and oh my god, I think everyone and their dog had posted on it, so changed it up. You're gonna get repeats at times, but I mean, for the most part, I try and give you a couple of unheards, but when the repeats come, and they will come. But today's video that was requested is actually a pretty crazy story, and was from Instagram. Actually, someone had sent me the request and gave me a lot of good details, so thank you for that. So let's just dive right into it today, and let's get ourselves nice and comfortable. Grab yourselves a nice glass of wine or a disgusting beverage. If any of you recognize this bottle from my wine tasting video, you're wondering, why are you opening that again? Well, it's the only thing I have in my house, so let's have a little mixed drink. And if you have seen that video, you will know that this drink got me a little pushed over the edge, so tonight'll be fun. Grab yourselves a Stones, a beer, crush some garlic peanuts, or put this on for your long drive home so that you can relax after a long day of work with crappy people. Let's ease our minds as we dive into and try and drift off to the story of Larry Jean Bell, courtesy of Scott. Thank you, Scott, for your great suggestion. I hope I do this story justice for you. I was gonna say something nice, but so Larry Jean Bell was born in Ralph, Alabama. Love a good city or town with a human name in it. He had 3 sisters and 1 brother, so a decent-sized family. They reportedly had moved around a lot throughout their lives, which I can relate to. I did as well. And apparently, he had attended high school at Eau Claire High in Columbia, South Carolina. blood sugar, and drove to her car. Again, 200 yards from the road. When he'd arrived at her car, he'd noticed it was still running. The front door was open, and she was gone. She wasn't disoriented, stumbling around, or fallen over. She vanished from thin air, and he had just seen her. So he looked for a little bit and phoned the sheriff of Lexington County right away. They had came, and her father told them that she was just there, not the type to disappear, not a runaway, a very good girl, a very good young lady. And the sheriff instantly questioned him about the relationship with the father, the mother, everything. And the family was very close, extremely religious, and they didn't really have any bad blood between anyone, no reason for her to run away. And if she was going to, she probably would have taken her car. So the investigator instantly had a bad feeling, just like the father, and had phoned it in right away. He had bypassed the regular 24 hours waiting period for a missing person and looked around trying to retrace her steps and not destroy any potential evidence. But honestly, there was nothing to see there. Within minutes, South Carolina officers arrived and investigators had combed the scene for any sort of evidence, tire tracks, footprints, that kind of thing, but found nothing. So authorities, knowing that time was of the essence here, established a task force very quickly, especially since they all felt that abduction was a very high possibility and very scary for them because it was so abnormal for the area. So word of Shari's disappearance spread quite much like wildfire, and hundreds of residents had shown up to participate in the search, but no trace of her was found anywhere. The lack of evidence was alarming. So they had called in the FBI for their expertise, for their assistance, and agents were instantly dispatched. The experts themselves, though, were baffled. There was really nothing that they could grasp onto, and the search continued around the clock. 2 days after the search had passed, the town, nothing came up. Everyone was horrified, and it was clear to residents that this was a child abduction. And basically, all the parents barricaded their kids inside, rightfully so, or their kids were clinging to their parents' side should they leave. And fair enough, I would do the same. But on June 3rd at 2:30 a.m., the Smiths family, so Shari Smiths, was called, and Shari's parents, Robert and Hilda, had woken up. So Hilda was asked for by the unknown caller, and the man claimed himself to be Shari's captor. He apologized for taking her, saying that it was a total accident, my bad, crazy person, and he assisted and reassured them that she would return, they would see her again soon. And he swore that he did not need a ransom, and he made it clear that he would go talk to them soon. But Shari had sent them a letter in the mail, and that he'd call back once he thought she'd received that letter. Psycho. She's like, okay, I have your daughter. It was a total accident to abduct her or whatever, but she's with me. She's fine. You'll see her soon. She sent you a letter. I don't know. Talk to you later. No, you're crazy. So anyway, the parents had a phone tap set up earlier, but the call was too short to capture anything, unfortunately. But imagine that call, getting that. Anyway. So they'd waited for this letter, or they thought they would, but investigators were like, no way, we're waking up the postmaster and we're going to go through everything they have. So sure enough, they did. And thankfully, it only took them about half an hour of sifting through mail and packages before they had found a letter that ended up being addressed for the family. But their hopes that they'd had and the excitement was very short-lived, as it was entitled Last Will and Testament from Shari Smith. Inside of it, it said, I love you, Mommy, Daddy Robert, Dawn, and Richard, and everyone else. And to all of my friends and relatives, my thoughts will always be with you. I'm sorry I ever disappointed you in any way. I've always just wanted you to sure enough, the handwriting had been confirmed as Shari's, and the examiners had then analyzed the letter for any fibers, prints, anything. But that does take a bit of time, so time is of the essence here. But it was sent through for to be analyzed. But she did use a lot of odd phrases, such as casket closed in brackets, with no real explanation as to why. So they now waited for the call the abductor claimed he was going to be making. They had waited, set up a tape recorder for should the call not go long enough to track him. And on June 3rd at 8 p.m., he had called asking to speak to Hilda, the mother. And you can actually hear all of these recordings, all of these calls on YouTube. If you want to put yourself through that, you can. Go check that out. And the call was something like this. Did you receive the letter today? Okay, good. So now you know that this call isn't a hoax. So listen, I know that these calls are being traced, and Hilda had asked if Shari was with the man. And the man said, Shari is now a part of me. Physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, our souls are one now. And we're trying to work this out. So please do what we ask, and hopefully, yada yada. He just rambled on about weird things. It didn't make sense. And Hilda kept trying to keep him on the phone for long enough. And they ended up tracing the call about 20 miles away at a telephone booth. But of course, all that they had found was a phone that was dangling and that was wiped clean of any prints. So Shari's older sister, Dawn, at the time, was confused. She didn't understand, had never dealt with anyone, anything like this before. But she thought he was taking care of her sister, and that there must be a reason for this. So the FBI from this phone call got a good glimpse at this strange man's character. He said some fairly odd things to the simplest of questions, after all. So they wanted to make a profile for him. So the profilers then attempt to think like the killer, to uncover any possible motivations, patterns, and they use a database that will actually emerge and create a personality type that they think the suspect could be like. And it's scary accurate, actually. The technology was actually created using behavior profiling tools over 25 years of interviews with killers, arsenic bombers, rapists, you name it. So the tool then creates the type of person that they think it might be. And this tool had gathered it to be a single white male, above average intelligence, a blue-collar man. And due to the fact that he could electronically change his voice over the phone, which I'm sorry if I didn't mention, if you watch the creepy videos online, you'll hear it, that he'd probably have experience with electrical contracting, a prior criminal record maybe, lived locally, most likely, and probably was a bit of a loner, a bit, kept a bit to himself. So they'd created this profile on him. And on June 5th, another call was received, and at this time, he had given the family directions to where he said they would find Shari. So, Highway 38 west to a traffic circle, turn left at a white framed building, 6 feet beyond, we're waiting, God has chose us. Something like that. It was really hard for me to decipher exactly what he was saying with that voice translator, and closed caption did nothing for me. So sure enough, So within moments of the abduction, the FBI knew that the cases were connected, and they were on it. They did not want time to slip away for this one. So at this time, it was maybe a week since Shari's murder, and officers really wanted to trick the captor. So they decided to team up with the local media to set a trap, hoping to catch the captor's attention and phone the family again. The key element did put Dawn at risk, however. They wanted the killer to call and ask to speak with Dawn for hopefully a long enough time to catch him. Investigators had promoted a memorial service for Shari and wanted it to rekindle his fascination with Dawn. They had grabbed personal items of Shari's, and Dawn looked a lot like her, so they dressed her up like her. She was holding a stuffed koala, which was Shari's, and they'd wanted maybe either the killer to approach her or to call. So Dawn had placed flowers in the koala bear on the sister's grave, and they'd waited, hoping this man would come and collect this as a memento maybe, or that he'd call. So detectives told her that this would be potentially dangerous. The man would probably threaten her if he did call back, but be sympathetic, be polite, don't be rude, pretend that you know how he's feeling. So several calls came to the home after the service, and they didn't know when this guy might call, so Dawn had to answer every single one of them. But of course, everyone wants to call, give their condolences, right? I mean, I would. But shortly after midnight, the call they were waiting for came in. The killer, as they'd hoped, changed his focus to Dawn entirely. He told her on his phone call that God wants you to join Shari. It's just a matter of time. And despite him threatening her, she took it. And before hanging up, the killer had offered her directions to where Debra May was waiting. So they traced the call, but it was just far enough outside the area that they definitely couldn't make it in time. But investigators took his directions to where they did end up finding the body of 9-year-old Debra May, which is quite sad. So these two girls had been murdered, abducted, and Dawn was now very much the next target, and they had little to no evidence available for both of these girls' situations. But forensic analysis from the last will and testament from Shari had finally finished being examined. It was examined using an ESDA, which fills in indentations on any document with graphite. They then use a excited, eager to wait for his arrival. And luckily, that day, the next morning at 7, an unmarked police car had followed behind him, and he had no clue. There was then a police car waiting to cut him off at an approaching intersection. The unmarked car corralled him into place, and on June 26 at 7:18 a.m., Larry Gene Bell was finally caught. So he didn't resist arrest. He was taken by the officers, and I love it. I love when justice works out. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Story's not done. So the South Carolina police arrested him on suspicion of kidnapping and murder, but they had to prove beyond any doubt that he had involvement, was the killer. They needed to get their ducks in a row fully. So as they all went to interview with Larry, they all just hated him right away. Apparently everything about him drove them crazy, and they set up an interrogation room hoping to provoke him to confess, to make it seem like the police had this all figured out and you might as well just confess, you know. They had our koala bear there, maps with where the phone calls were had, notes and filing cabinets with his name on it, and detectives during that time had a search warrant of the Shepherd's home, and a forensic team went through the entire house, and they'd actually found underneath the mattress that he was sleeping on a porn magazine and a gun. They had also found in the carpets a blonde hair that did match to Shari Smith. So thank God, I love it. But meanwhile, the investigators, while they were looking through the home still, they were interviewing Larry back at downtown. They tried to reason with him to feel his pain, and they'd walk through all the evidence with him, and he denied everything. But he did make a weird request, saying that he'd like to meet Dawn and Hilda. And sure enough, the Smiths agreed to meet with him. They were hoping that an emotional response might force him to confess. So once they'd met him, Dawn was there, Hilda was there. He'd mumbled and just went on and on about how he was so sorry about what happened to her. He didn't do it. He wasn't involved. But another Larry Bell could have done it, whatever that means. And Dawn said that she was disgusted, she felt angry, and she was mad that he wouldn't just say it. But Hilda, listen, great woman. She said to him, I know that you're the man who killed my daughter, but honestly, I don't hate you. And she kind of just waited, and he broke down instantly, started crying, but didn't say anything, would not admit to boo. So the investigators had pieced together what they believe happened the day that Shari was abducted. So Larry noticed, and I mean, I'm not downplaying Dawn, that's very sad, but Shari's was so much longer and drawn out, and he tortured the family. Dawn, it was only a day or so, and he luckily did not call and harass that family, mess with their minds, torture them. So that's the only good thing, I guess, is that, you know, I mean, of course they were horrified, but that element wasn't there for them. So they believe that Larry noticed Shari after dropping his mother off at a doctor's appointment, and as she left the parking lot, he'd followed her. She must have been hanging out with friends near the same complex, whatever, a young girl. She didn't notice that she was being followed. She'd pulled into her driveway to stop at the mailbox when he grabbed her, taking her surprise, and held her at a gunpoint. He then had brought her to the Shepherd's home and canceled dinner plans with his friends, saying that he wanted to stay inside and watch the baseball game. But at that time, had Shari tied to his bed. So sure enough, less than an hour into deliberation, and Larry was found guilty for the murder of Shari, and then guilty at a separate trial for the murder of Debra. During the 6